Hello, my friends. How are you? I hope you're doing very well. Well, time for another session of Sunday school, and we are still in Lent, which began on Ash Wednesday. So this is our second Sunday of Lent, and today we're going to be looking at trust. Now, I don't know how much you know about Lent, other than that it's the time of about 6 weeks before Easter, where we really study Jesus' life and his teachings to get ready for the crucifixion and Easter, the joy of Easter. Now, some people will give something up for Lent, and some people will do something extra for Lent. Some people give up sweets. Some people will do volunteer work. So it's either giving something up or doing something extra to bring you closer to God. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to do, but it's something that we don't have to do. And let me tell you a little bit about that. Here's this week's leaflet. I don't know if you have it, but here are some things, like washing your hands without being asked, feeding your dog, praying, and studying the Bible like we do together. And all of these are really good things, but we don't need to do them to get closer to God, and that's because of the cross. That's because of Jesus. Jesus took care of that for us by getting us all the forgiveness and grace that God has to offer. So anytime we do something, we're not doing it to get closer to God. We're doing it to respond to God as a way of saying thank you and praising God for the gift of Jesus and for the gifts of forgiveness and grace. Because you see, because of that grace, we don't have to worry about making ourselves right with God. It's already been done for us. So that frees us up to do everything we do out of love. So we might be doing the same exact things like giving something up or taking something new on, but the reason we're doing them is very different. There's not that trying to measure up, trying to be the best. There's just thanksgiving. It comes out of thanksgiving and gratitude as a way to praise God. And we're going to talk today about a letter that was written by Paul. And I don't know if you remember who Paul was. Paul started out not as a friend of Christians. He started out trying to get rid of Christians because he thought they were dangerous. They didn't want to go along with the rulers, and they preached peace and war, and not fighting in wars and taking care of each other. So they were seen as a threat to the people who were in charge. So Paul was going to go to Damascus, which is a city in the Middle East, not terribly far from Jerusalem. It's in the same general area. And he was going to find these Christians so that they could get rid of them. But what happened was Jesus came to him as he was riding down the road and knocked him off his horse, and he was even blind for a little while. And when Paul met Jesus, he was so changed that he became one of Jesus' best friends here on earth. And he went out and he founded churches and he preached the gospel a lot. So Paul was really a pretty big deal, though he never thought of himself that way. But so Paul wanted to reach out to some folks in Rome. So we're going to learn how he did that. Because he wanted to explain faith to them. So we're going to look at our Bible on page 458. I was a little bit too far. And we're going to talk about the Roman believers. Okay? So here's some pictures. There's Paul. He really wanted to go to Rome, and he couldn't make it, so he sat down and wrote him a letter. So let's see what that looked like. Paul could hardly wait to visit Rome. He wanted to help the Roman believers to learn more about God. Rome was farther away from home than Paul had ever been before. He needed to sail across the sea to get there. How long would it take him? More than one day, more than 1 week, more than 1 month, maybe even more than a whole year. Because ships weren't real fast in those days, and they ran into storms, and they would often make several stops on a trip because they had things that they were going to trade. So they'd go from port to drop off what they had and to pick up new cargo. So it could be a long time before you got to where you were going. You had to be patient. So before Paul began his journey to Rome, he decided to write the people a letter. He knew God loved the Roman believers and they loved God, but he also thought they might have lots and lots of questions. Paul asked God to help him know what to write. Dear Roman believers, God gives us lots of rules. God's rules are important, but faith in God is more important than following rules all the time. Having faith means you trust God's promises. Having faith means God promises to love you and knowing that's true. Jews and non-Jews, even when you make mistakes. So what mistakes have you made in your life? If I sat here and told you all the mistakes I made, we'd be here for a very, very long time. But what's wonderful is, because of Jesus, I know that my mistakes are forgiven. So that helps me to go on. And gratitude for that forgiveness, I want to do better. Now, that doesn't mean if I mess up again, God won't forgive me. God always forgives us. So a person that Paul talked about in his letter to the Romans was named Abraham. And I think we talked about Abraham before. Abraham and his wife Sarah. And if you recall, they were very, very old people. And God promised them that they would have a son to carry on their name, because that was a very big deal back in those days. Because the inheritance, what you got passed from father to son. Unfortunately, women weren't thought of real highly back then, so that's not too good. But things are better now. So anyway, here are Abraham and Sarah. And they trusted. Having faith means you trust God's promises. So they trusted God's promises, and it got them, my little stick baby here, it got them a son named Isaac. Now there's kind of a funny story about Isaac's name. Isaac means laughter. And they named him Laughter because when God came to visit Abraham with a couple of his angels in a human form, looked like a person just like you and me, he told Sarah that she would have a baby, she would have a son. And of course, Sarah, realizing she was very, very old, probably older than your grandparents even, thought this was kind of funny, and I can't say I blame her, so she started to laugh. And God said to her, I heard you laughing. And Sarah, how when you get caught doing something wrong, said, I didn't laugh. And God said, oh, yes, you did. But God didn't hold it against her. He probably understood that she thought it was pretty out of bounds to be promised a baby at her age. But yet, lo and behold, about a year or so later, here came Isaac. She was able to get pregnant and have a baby. So they named him Isaac, which means laughter, to remember God's promise. Yeah, even though they had been skeptical and they had laughed, God had come through as God promised. And that's the thing about God's promises, is we make promises and we want to keep them, but we don't always, do we? We don't always. But what we know is that God keeps God's promises. Now think of all the stuff you do. I mean, I talked very little bit about some of the things that I've done. And they got in my way of my relationship with God. I was paying attention to other things. So this was kind of God's love for me. And I thought that all my mistakes had covered it up. But nope, that wasn't true, you see, because of the cross, because of that forgiveness. Ta-da! God's love, God's grace, God's promises are always, always there. So, as you're thinking about that, think about who needs to know that God's promises are there for them. Can you think of someone who's having a hard time right now and who maybe is struggling with their faith? Because that can happen to all of us, absolutely. Who needs to hear that God's promises are true, that they can trust God to love and forgive them always, and that God is with us always, even when things seem to be going pretty badly? So think about how can you be a bringer of God's promises and let people know that God is with them, that they are forgiven, and that they are loved. Think about that. There may be someone in your life. And think about Paul, who was so excited about sharing the story of Jesus that he couldn't wait until he could go in person, that he sent a letter because it was so important to him that the folks in Rome knew about God and God's love. So think of being on a journey. You see an island. You can't get under it. You can't get over it. So you go around it. So think of a big storm, maybe one of the things that slowed Paul's journey down. You can't go over it. And you can't go under it. Sometimes you just got to go through it. What about a tidal wave? I mean, when those big waves come, you can't go under them. You don't want to go under them. You can't get high enough to get over them. You got to go through them. And finally, like Paul, you make it to Rome. And in all the things that hold us back in our journey, and here we were talking about actual things like the island and the storm and the tidal wave, but there are things every day that can take our attention and hold us back from our journey to God. But what we know is that no matter what we're going through, when we're in the storms, when we're having to go around obstacles or go through obstacles, that God is always with us. And that is God's promise. So have faith, because God's promises, God's love and forgiveness are for you. Take care now and have a great week. Bye-bye.